The idea is that you are the collection of all of your interests. Attention is the prioritization of those interests. And that prioritization work, that act, is what makes the self have some kind of power. It's a very popular view in philosophy to see consciousness as the thing and self as non-existence and an illusion. And what I'm doing is I'm saying the self is the thing, and then consciousness is just the way that the self is related to its world. I think that one of the reasons that people will be uncomfortable with it who have been in consciousness research for a long time is just because it's become so popular to think about consciousness as a thing. So popular that people say things like,
this is Brain Inspired.
This is Brain Inspired. Hey everyone, I'm Paul. William James, the super influential psychologist and philosopher, famously in 1890 wrote, "Everyone knows what attention is." That turned out not to be true. Instead, like other cognitive functions we give names to, like memory or consciousness, the more that we study attention, the more subdivided the concept becomes, leading to a taxonomy to describe the varieties of what we collectively call attention, like top-down versus bottom-up attention, feature-based versus spatial attention, overt versus covert attention, and so on. And some people even argue that the word attention isn't even useful anymore, and we should abandon it. Carolyn Dicey Jennings is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist at the University of California, Merced, and in her book, The Attending Mind, she lays out an attempt to unify the concept of attention. Carolyn defines attention roughly as the prioritization of some stuff over other stuff, based on our collective interests. And one of her main claims is that attention is evidence of a real emergent self or subject that can't be reduced to microscopic brain activity. She does connect attention to more macroscopic brain activity, suggesting that slow, longer-range oscillations in our brains can alter or entrain the more local neural activity. And this is a candidate for mental causation. So we unpack that more in our discussion and how Carolyn situates attention among other cognitive functions like consciousness, action, and perception. I link to her book and some other relevant articles, and you can learn more about Carolyn in the show notes at braininspired.co/podcast/153. On the website, you can also sign up to support Brain Inspired via Patreon for various bells and whistles, like full episodes and joining our Discord community. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters, and thank you for listening or watching. All right, here's Carolyn. Carolyn, the book is The Attending Mind. And right before we were talking here, I was frantically looking it up because, of course, it has a subtitle, but it has no subtitle. Why no subtitle?
Yeah, no subtitle. I like things to be short and sweet, I guess.
They didn't ask you for it. All books, all science books or philosophy books have subtitles, right? This is important, hard-hitting interview questions here.
Yeah, I guess they do often have long subtitles. I'm really inspired by philosophers like Susan Wolf, who try to connect more with the public, or Fredretsky, who try to be really clear with their writing. And that's a goal of mine. And I feel sometimes like the really long subtitles are at odds with that. So
okay. Well, so the title is very short. And by the way, I like that it has no subtitle, by the way. It's not a criticism.
Okay.
But the book and the book is not long either, but it is dense and thick and has lots of goes down lots of paths, lots of details and stuff. Maybe I'll just start off with a a very easy quote here from the book, and then we can unpack it, right? Consciousness is the interface between a subject and its world. Action is the subject's contribution to that interface, and attention is but one way to get there. So we have a lot to unpack here, perhaps. So like I was saying, the book covers like a lot of ground in philosophy and neuroscience and psychology. And there's no way that we're going to get to all of the topics discussed in the book. And this book was 2 years old now, so it's probably old hat for you. And it was based on over a decade of your previous works and thinking.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start with, we're going to have to unpack the ideas in the book, many of them, but maybe what I want to start with is just asking you what you feel most sure about in your work. And I don't know how your mind has developed and changed since publishing this work in terms of the ideas that we'll get to. But what do you feel most sure about in the book?
I feel the most sure about the existence of the self, which
Ooh.
is, I would say, the strongest claim of the book as well. So that, that's probably where that there is something responsible for attention that it could be seen as one possible solution to the problem of free will, for example, the problem of agency. I feel confident about that. And in keeping with that, I feel pretty confident about the rejection of a reductionist perspective of the universe, that all causation occurs at one level, that all science occurs at one level, and that we should think of science as ultimately coming back to one level, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I feel confident about that it's actually really useful to think in terms of multiple levels, and that agency is one of the cases where you can really see that. So that's where I feel confident. I would say places where a part of the book that I feel less confident about and I haven't continued to work on would be the stuff about legal theory all the way at the end, which kind of makes sense because it sort of starts with the stuff that I'm the most excited about in the book and kind of ends with the stuff that I feel the least confident about, but it's sort of going out into a new direction that I may continue later. But there are also things that I just didn't complete in the book. And so in a way, I feel less confident about those things too, but I'm hoping to complete them eventually. And those are things like, where is the boundary between self and world? How would you quantify that? How would you, and in a way, without knowing where that boundary is, you don't really know exactly what the self is. So knowing the limits of the self, I don't feel fully confident about. That there is one I feel confident about, but not where exactly it ends. And then also connected with that, the details of the view on consciousness, I'm still working out. So that's something that I'm actually working on this year, is writing up my view of consciousness, which I didn't complete in the book.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You, I think you even mentioned in the book that it was at the time sort of an incomplete beginning of your conception. So you see consciousness as the interface between the subject or self and the world. Maybe, I guess we should back up and talk about your conception of the self then. And you use terms like agency just now. So I have, and I want to ask also about, well, let's start with the conception of the self that you lay out in the book. And you say that attention or top-down attention is evidence for an emergent self. And of course, I want to get into the neuroscience of it all as well. But maybe you could hash out just a little bit more what you mean by the self, if you're so confident about it.
You're taking me to task. Yes. All right. So I see the self as a collection of interests. I see an interest as a tendency to seek out and respond to stimuli in a certain way. This is a kind of like psychological definition. So it's a psychology directed definition. And then I see the act of attention, as you said, as foundation of the self. So when that collection of interests, so saying that the self is a collection of interests, in philosophy, we have this idea that existence is very closely connected with causation. So if you are something that exists, you ought to have some sort of causal power.
Okay.
Everything in philosophy is controversial. So of course that too is some controversy, but most people feel comfortable with that if something exists, then it has some form of causal power. So when I say that the self is a collection of interests, if it's going to be something that you can mark out as existing in the world, then you want that collection of interests to have some sort of causal power to do something, not just be descriptive. Like, yes, you can draw a circle around any number of things, but if it's going to really be something we're going to talk about and do science about, it should do something beyond just that description. So what that is, I think, is attention. So that collection of interests has causal power over its individual interests. So you could think of this instead of in terms of causal power, you could think of it in terms of constraint. So one of the things I do in the book is I talk about the difference between what one philosopher calls macroscopic determination and causal power. I still think that the self has causal power, but you might think of that relationship of the self over its interests as just in terms of constraint. So it's basically constraining which interests get to make it up. And that happens in attention. So attention is like the prioritization of those interests. Your interest in podcasts, your interest in a hot cup of tea, that your attention is basically ranking those things. And so right now you may have a hot cup of tea in front of you and you have my voice as well. And your attention has both of those things available to it. And it's kind of prioritizing one over the other. And it may shift those priorities over time. But the idea is that you are the collection of all of your interests. Attention is the prioritization of those interests. And that prioritization work, that act, is what makes the self have some kind of power. And it begins with that constraining of its own interests. So by ranking them, it's allowing some to gain dominance. But then that prioritization work allows for, I think, causal power of the self over its world. So that's where the actual causal power, not mere kind of constraining power, comes in. I don't know if that was too much information.
No, I mean,
that was just enough.
Yeah, we can go down.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so many different roads that we can go down. But but you sort of redefine. Okay, so I'm like preparing a lesson or two in my the course that I offer on attention.
Okay.
And reading your book already, I was overwhelmed with concepts of attention, different types of attention, top down, bottom up, feature based, visual. And then I come across your book and you define attention at the whole organism level, right, as this set of interests. And I think, oh man, now I know, it's another way to conceive of attention. So how much of your work hinges on reconceptualizing attention, and are people dissatisfied with the idea that you're trying to sort of reconceptualize attention as this collection of interests?
That's a good question. So as you know, because you've looked into attention, even the idea that attention is something is controversial in the sciences. Right. So since the 80s, Alan Allport said, like, let's stop using this nonsense term. There's so many things that people are calling attention. I think some of that is true. So one of a kind of glossy historical view is that one of the results of behaviorism, of course, is that psychology wasn't allowed to talk about consciousness for a long time. Even after the cognitive revolution, it wasn't popular to talk about consciousness. So then attention starts, or attention. Yeah. So, but attention came back with the cognitive revolution and consciousness didn't. So I think attention ended up kind of filling in a lot of roles. And it seemed like attention was kind of behind everything. And now, of course, people can talk about consciousness again in sciences. And it seems like now people are putting attention a little bit more in its place. But I think that the reaction against attention has been too strong as well. And that has happened both in the sciences, starting with Allport, and in philosophy. So in philosophy, too, there are people who claim that there's no such thing as attention, that there's no unifying thing that is attention. Some people have tried to provide a unifying account. I'm one of the people who is trying to do that. So what I see myself as doing is trying to provide an account of what attention is in a unified sense. And I still think that there are many different types of attention. There may be some things we don't get to call attention anymore once we've accepted this unifying account, but it's not supposed to it's not supposed to be redefining it in the sense of adding another form of attention or shifting the narrative on attention. It's supposed to be taking what we already believe about attention and giving like a how possible account of that. So instead of, for example, Wayne Wu says that his unifying account of attention is that it's necessary for action. So attention is a thing that provides for action. So it's for action, whereas for me, it's by the subject. So while Wayne Wu is probably my favorite alternative account, I think that it's not necessary to have bodily action, which is the one that I think he's going to have to be stuck with in his account. I don't think that it's necessary that attention is always for that. So I think that a deeper understanding of attention would be that it's by this subject. And the problem is, of course, Wayne Wu doesn't want to accept the existence of the subject, and most people don't. So I think that's one reason why that has to be something that I'm confident in, because it's the key to my account of attention.
Yeah. So I have in my notes here, one way to think of your account of attention is like attention with a capital A. And then, because from my background, I've studied a lot of like lower level neural mechanisms that are supposed to account for different types of attention. And I thought, are those all lowercase a types of attention? And your account of attention is like the attention related to the self. Is that the grandmother of them all or grandfather of them all kinds of attention? Is that the way that you think of it? Or I want to get into the neural mechanisms that you propose underlying your account of attention here also. Yeah.
So I think one way of seeing that I'm trying to do a unifying account is that the self is related to attention in some way. That's true, that is the core of my account. But I allow for a pretty weak version of that. So if the input of the self or the subject, basically if feedback makes no difference to the prioritization work, the selection work, then there's no attention in my view. So if it's a purely filtering mechanism, then it's not attention. But if that feedback, prefrontal feedback, the input of the self, whatever, there's different levels of discussion here. But if that feedback makes a difference to the resulting prioritization, then attention is involved. So I also have a unifying account of bottom-up and top-down attention. That doesn't mean that they don't have different effects. That is that I see the two as input to a common system. So bottom-up attention famously is this, you have this very salient thing in your environment, and that grabs your attention. And then the question is that can that be purely passive? If it could be purely passive, then it wouldn't count as attention in my view. But my idea is that even bottom-up attention is still being weighed against the interests of the subject. And there is some evidence for that. I'm sure you're thinking of a lot of the different papers out there in your head about this controversy. But that's another thing that I'm arguing, is that attention can actually go pretty far down, where it just can't go all the way down to, some people want to say anytime there's any neural preference, it's attention. And I am disputing that. So the fact that in the fovea, that some of the cells in the fovea have a preference for certain wavelengths and others have a preference for other wavelengths, that's not attention in my view. So mere filtering won't count. But a lot of other things would count.
You don't talk about predictive processing or like a Bayesian brain account in the book, but this, like that, what you just said about bottom-up attention being needs to be affected or unified with a top-down attention, that somewhat aligns with a predictive processing viewpoint, if that makes sense. I guess that's a question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that when I began working on this in graduate school, these ideas, I was aware of the reverse hierarchy stuff, of course. I was aware that people were starting to think about that. Predictive processing wasn't yet a thing.
Right.
So I wouldn't say
was this back in the 80s that you were in graduate school?
No, the 2000s. So maybe it was a thing, but it wasn't a thing for me, I guess, is what I'm saying. It seems like it's really blossomed in the last 10 years. So I was in graduate school between 2006 and 2012.
Mhm.
But I have since learned more about it, and I don't think that it conflicts with anything it doesn't conflict with my approach. I'm not really drawn to the predictive processing or Bayesian approach. I don't think that it's wrong. I don't think that it certainly has tools that are valuable. And of course that kind of top down way of thinking about things is valuable. But I also don't find it to be fully explanatory. So I haven't done the work of mapping my view onto it because I haven't been especially drawn to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not conflicting with your account. It just struck me that it's complementary potentially. But
it
yeah,
could be. I think where one of the things that's missing from predictive processing approaches is, I mean, they don't have a subject, but they don't, like, motivation is famously a problem for those approaches. And for me, that's key. Like, the interests are key. This kind of thing driving you out. We're not just prediction machines, I think. We are organisms with interests. So kind of at the heart of the theory is where we diverge. And so I'm just not sure how much I'm going to be able to get out of that view, basically.
But our interests are presumably generated via our needs, right? And motivations and bodily needs in the world. And so that's like a bottom up sort of approach, but your account of attention is it is a top down. The interests are having an effect on the bottom up processing.
That's right. Yeah. So the interests themselves you could see as kind of bottom up. There's different types of bottom, I guess. There's there's two ways in which the subject could be differentiated from non-subject, and one is world versus subject, so stimuli versus interests. So some things in the brain are going to be categorized as interests, some things as stimuli, but there's also interests that are the subjects and interests that are not the subjects. So you might have, like, genetic predispositions that are not aligned closely with you as a subject. So anytime there's been competition between those genetic predispositions and some other interest of yours, you've always prioritized, the non-genetic predisposition, then, like, that's been kind of cast out. And that's not as non-subject as the stimuli are non-subject. But it's still kind of bottom up in a way. So I guess I'm saying that you could see interest as kind of bottom up, but they're not in the same way, not in the same fashion. So, but regardless, interests come from somewhere. What do we mean by top down here? It's when there's reference to the set of interests, when the set has some kind of control over the parts of the set, that's when I'm saying that there's a subject involved.
So let's go ahead and talk about consciousness before we get into, like, neural mechanisms of your account. So I guess the commonplace view, or the way that I feel like it's something. There's something it's like to be me, right? And presumably that's the consciousness. But you separate, and my identity I equate with that sense of being. I was going to say self, but my subjective experience, right? But on your account, the self, myself, is separate from my consciousness. And so, which I'm becoming more comfortable with as I read more of your work and think about it more, because there's all sorts of things that we do unconsciously, of course. But help me be more relaxed about my identity, because I think of my identity as my consciousness, my subjective experience, but you're saying my identity is something completely separate. So can we talk about the difference between consciousness and attention and self?
Yeah. So one of the key things to see how my view is really different from the contemporary thrust about self and consciousness is my methodology. So many of the people who want to reject the existence of a self, they seem to think that you have to be limited to phenomenological evidence from experience. So they say things like, when you do LSD, you don't have an experience of self, so there's no self. Or when you meditate, you don't have an experience of self, so there's no self. Or it's possible to trick somebody into thinking that they did something, but they didn't. So there's no self. But it's always from within experience. And so if it's possible for you to not have a self in experience, then there must not really be a self. It must be an illusion or a hallucination or whatever. My methodology is different. I follow this idea of Owen Flanagan, for example. He calls it the natural method, where you see experience as important evidence. It's not something that we should be discarding as scientists. Experience is a source of evidence about what's going on with somebody's mind. But behavior is also important evidence, and neuroscience is also important evidence, like physiological evidence is also important evidence. And experience does not trump the other two. So when you're trying to figure out what's going on with the mind, you have to triangulate between the three, because all three can kind of get it wrong in different ways. And so the subject I see as existing apart from experience. It's a thing in the world, just like a chair or a tree is a thing in the world. I think the subject's something in the world.
When you say subject, you equate that with self, right? That is there.
Yeah, okay. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I usually use subject just to try, because like you say, there are many different ideas of what the self is. I see subject as the heart of all of those. And I see attention as at the heart of the subject. So okay. I do think it's going to come back to the subject, what the self is, but I'm trying to avoid this conflation with something like identity.
Right.
Which I think is layered on top of the subject. So your history is layered on top of this power you have over your mind. I think you wouldn't have identity if you didn't have the power over your mind, but obviously your identity is more than that power. That's coming from years of that power being applied to different scenarios. And then also just the way you conceptualize that. So I'm not dealing with the conceptualization. I'm not dealing with the history. I'm looking for like, what is at the heart of what it means to be someone? And at the heart there, I think, is this power of attention, this power you have over your own mind to prioritize your interests. And where I see consciousness, and this is what I'm working on right now, this is what I'm writing up right now, maybe it would be easier. I call the interface view in the book now, and I also talk about it as a relation. I find relation might be an easier way of thinking about it. So I see consciousness as not a thing. I think it's been a very popular view in philosophy to see consciousness as the thing and self as non-existence and an illusion. And what I'm doing is I'm saying the self is a thing, and then consciousness is just the way that the self is related to its world. So it's the relation between the two. It's not a thing in itself that would invoke this philosophical problem. You don't want to have relations be things, because then you have to have another thing between that thing and the original. So if you have two things related, and then the relation is a third thing, they call this a third man problem, then the third thing has its relation to one of the two things. That relation would have to be a thing. And then the relation, so you kind of get this infinite.
Ad infinitum.
Yeah, exactly. So relations are not things. Relations are just relations. They're their own metaphysical status. And I think consciousness should be seen as a relation rather than a thing. Why
am I so uncomfortable with thinking of my subjective experience as a relation instead of like my own, right? I want it to be my own.
It is your own. So because it's a relation between the subject and the world, then it's necessarily subjective. It's related to the subject. It doesn't exist without the subject. So it still has all of the qualities of consciousness that we normally, I think actually this is a helpful way. I think bringing back the subject to philosophy is a helpful way of managing those problems of consciousness, because we don't really have a good way of inserting subjectivity, I think, without the subject. So you still get that. I think that one of the reasons that people will be uncomfortable with it who have been in consciousness research for a long time is just because it's become so popular to think about consciousness as a thing, so popular that people say things like that your experience is a hallucination. So that's like a Neil Seth's view. It's an informed hallucination. I think that there's something in your brain that is consciousness that you're related to, that's totally separate from the outside world, is so popular that I think it's hard to think of it a different way. But I'm basically like trying to remove that weird veil that we've created. I don't think that's a popular view outside of academia. I don't think that most people think that they're like in contact with some kind of stuff that's in between them and the world that is consciousness. I don't think that's a typical view. I think it's something that we've come to after hundreds of years of philosophy and science. For some reason, I think we've reified that relation into being a thing. Yeah.
So you mentioned the brain. So let's go ahead and talk about the brain. And I mean, I know I'm jumping around here, but this is all related, of course. First of all, did you have this conception of attention and then go searching for a potential neural account of it? Or were you doing all of these things in parallel? And then, maybe just describe what you see as the neural basis or mechanism underlying your account of attention.
Yeah, so the process question is a good one. I would say...
Wait, I have a guess at this. Can I guess first? Because I know that you're a certified yoga instructor. My wife is also. My guess is that this all began as you were either meditating or in your yoga practice. Is that a? It is
not a good guess. It is not a good guess.
Come on, let's do stereotypical
I really
cliche.
Like that. I mean, I love that. I love the idea that I would be like so in touch with my mind.
Well, but
somehow get there that way.
Yeah, but that meditative kind of practice, that contemplative sort of practice, these thoughts can arise, right? And paying attention to one's own mind, for instance.
Well, I do think that if you look at the history of Indian philosophy, which is closely connected to yoga, that you find some of the most interesting work on attention. So attention has been largely absent from Western philosophy for the last 100 years or so. And that is not true in Indian philosophy. So it's had a better run there, and there's a lot more work there. And some of the ideas that I have, and there are at least debates within Indian philosophy about the same issues. So it's not a bad guess, but for me, it was more that I think that an especially personal and historical account is not really what would be the most entertaining to your listeners. But I guess I came to the view that there must be a self by looking at a lot of research on attention, basically. Okay. And I had meetings with some of my advisors. I remember in particular a meeting with Christoph Koch. So Christoph Koch is like this pretty prominent neuroscientist who's worked on consciousness. And I remember I was going on a different path with my dissertation. I had a meeting with him. I don't even remember what his critique was exactly, but he just asked a question about a move I was making in my dissertation at that time. And then it suddenly came to me that I was on the wrong path, and that the arguments that I was trying to make about perception weren't going to work because I needed this commitment to the self, basically. I needed there to be a subject. And then I was like, I think that there is one. I just had been, I think, trying to work without it, without even thinking about it. And then I suddenly realized that I needed one. And so then I kind of went back to the attention research, and then that made sense to me, that would unite a lot of that research together. So it was, I'm not really answering your question very clearly.
Well, there's like before and after. So you were a convert to the idea of a real subject or self, and before you could sort of agreed with the contemporary philosophy that there is no self?
I didn't, it's not that I just didn't have a position on it.
Okay. Yep.
I didn't have a position on it. I would say that on most of my views, I'm a convert. And I started out as a philosopher of physics before I turned to philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of psychology. And I was the kind of person who hated dualism, hated free will, loved Dan Dennett. That's my backstory.
Okay.
So, but, Dan Dennett has a kind of compatibilist picture. Mm-hmm. Many of the people who have thought a lot about the issues tend to have a kind of in-between view rather than an extreme view. So from undergraduate to graduate, I went from a kind of more extreme physics-like view where everything's reductive, everything's deterministic at the micro level, to starting to realize it was a little bit more complicated than that. And kind of adding in things as I thought I had to. And that's kind of, I guess that's another way of putting how I got here. Yeah.
Okay. So I know this is just a diversion and we're going to get back to it, but back to the, back on track. But so you corrected your dissertation and did you bring it back to Christoph? And he said, oh, this is now all correct. Was that his?
Well, Christoph wasn't on my committee.
Okay.
But he was just like an informal advisor. But I did continue to talk to him, and I think he knows what my full view is, and we've had lots of conversations about it. I think, we don't share the exact same views, but we have a lot of commonalities and a lot of shared perspectives on the brain. Yeah. I think the biggest divergence right now is that he is really into IIT. And while I think that IIT gets many things right about consciousness, I obviously don't fully agree from what I just said. But I'm actually still exploring exactly where we diverge, because IIT's hard to understand, and all of its implications are hard to understand. Yeah.
But don't you think that IIT is measuring selfness more than consciousness?
That is what
right?
I think. And I'm surprised that you know that.
I don't know why I know that.
Yeah.
I do a lot of research for these things.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah. So that's right. So I think that the integrated information complex, that would be better understood as the subject rather than consciousness. Now, one of the graduate students that I'm working with, I'm not his main advisor, but I'm on his committee here at UC Merced, Sergio Ponce de Leon, he recently pointed out to me that in a footnote of Tononi's 2004 paper, I think, that he says that the complex is the subject. And so that's thrown me for a loop a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. Because,
wait, what?
Yeah.
But I kind of get it. I mean, I think I can still see his picture and how it's different from my picture, but I really need to go back and revisit that early work and think about what he meant by that. Because I was just at a conference in September. We were both, Tononi and I were both at, Julio, I should say, I guess. Julio and I were both at this conference in September. And I talked with him a little bit and I told him, I'm going to be criticizing your work here. I'm going to be saying that.
He's used to that.
Yeah, of course. And I said, I'm going to say that consciousness does not emerge. And he was like, I agree. I was like, well, this is awkward. Because I could have sworn you had a bunch of papers saying that consciousness emerged. But he definitely says that there is this emergent causal power related to IIT, but he does not think that it's consciousness that emerges. So yeah, it's a complicated view. That's my point, is it's like kind of hard to put all the pieces together. But I think he thinks that consciousness is very closely related to the complex. You've got the qualia space or whatever. And that's where the panpsychism comes in, is it's kind of like the flip side or something of it. I think what he thinks is that I really don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if he still wants to say that complex is the subject and consciousness. It's kind of both.
Right. The conflating the two, right? Which a lot of your work has been done to keep them separate.
Right. Yeah. So I think there is still sunlight between our views, but I have to work a little harder on figuring out exactly how that all comes together. So that's where, if I were to have a conversation with Christoph today, and I haven't for years, I'm guessing that's where we would disagree. But yeah, I believe that I've been able to convince him of at least one thing in the past. So I feel good about that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much he's been, but for the most part, I learn from my advisors rather than vice versa.
Sure.
I suspect.
Well, okay. Before we move on, I just had Michael Anderson on talking about his book After Phrenology. And toward the end of the episode, he was relating, because I was asking him how he, came to these ideas. And he, which I think is rare, had like a eureka sort of moment that led to him. And so are you saying that yours came about like from this meeting that you had? Was it kind of a eureka moment, or was it a more normal, gradual realization?
I would say it's both. So I definitely had a eureka-like moment then. It's not like I knew what the full view would be.
Right.
I had an insight, but it took more time. And I remember having a similar meeting with my main advisor, Dan Dahlstrom, where I also realized, okay, this is, I'm going to have to do something here.
So it's kind of a feeling in the back of your head that something wasn't right, and you knew.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I would say. Yeah, the Christoph meeting was like, okay, this doesn't work. And then like, I need something to fix this. There's a conflict here in the dissertation or a gap or something. And then later realizing, this is what makes sense of it all. I need to turn a little bit on this. It didn't end up changing a lot of the language. It just, in my assumptions, in my mind, it changed a lot. Yeah.
But did it make everything else kind of come into alignment, like how all of the different pieces? But it seems like that would have occurred, right? So so then you just had to go figure out, just essentially describe in words how they're aligned, right?
Okay. And I'm still kind of doing that. I kind of have a master view of the mind, but it's not like every single piece is worked out. Like I was saying, that the line between the subject and the world, I don't know exactly where that is, that boundary. So it's not like I've worked everything out, but that piece was really helpful for seeing more of how the view would work out. Yeah.
Okay, so the neural mechanism of your account of attention depends on, leans on oscillations and the scale-free dynamics of brain activity. Yeah. So maybe you can you just describe what those oscillations are and why they're important? And then I'll ask you, well, go ahead first, and then I'll ask you follow-ups.
Okay.
I don't want to throw like 7 questions at you at once, which is I often do. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm not good at answering 7 questions. I have to write them down when they come in parts like that, so I don't lose track of them. But the simple view of what like an oscillation is that it's just brain firing at a longer temporal duration or a larger spatial scale. So, neurons passing an action potential from one to another, that if you zoom in, then you just call that like neural firing. If you zoom out, you add up that neural firing over time and over space, then it might look like an oscillation. It might look like that sometimes there's more of that neural firing at one moment, and the next moment there's less of the neural firing, and then you get a wave. So you get a peak and a trough. So the oscillations are just neural firing over time. That's not all that they are in my view, because if that's all that they were, then we would be at a mere descriptive account of neural firing at a different scale. And I don't think that, this is another place where I can't remember if I said this is one of the places that I have less confidence about, but one of the places I have less confidence about is what exact physiological mechanism would account for these like oscillation, like the fact that there's some modulatory effects from the oscillations over the firing. So that's something that a number of neuroscientists have started to assert. Earl Miller, there's a lot of back and forth on Twitter when I used to be on Twitter between Earl Miller and other neuroscientists about this. So it's becoming, it's a new view that's out there in neuroscience that the oscillations have modulatory power over neural firing. They're responsible for local field potentials. They're responsible for haptic coupling. That's something that I see as helping my view of attention. But what the exact physiological basis of that could be, I'm not sure. And I think a helpful way of seeing this point is, I love this example that you can find these videos online of, what are those called? The things that help keep time. Anyhow, an oscillator, but in music they use these things.
Metronomes.
Metronome, thank you.
Oh yeah, the thing
there's these great videos online. Yes, yeah. So they'll have all these metronomes that are like out of time on a table, and if you watch the video over time, then they sync up and they're all going together. So the idea that a lot of people have about the brain is that there's something similar going on with this, where the control of the oscillatory activity over the more local neural firing activity is like that there's a kind of forcing in line of the local activity into the global activity. But that only works with metronomes because they're sitting on a table.
Right.
So the vibrations of the metronomes is being like gathered in the table and then kind of communicated to the other metronomes.
Tiny little nudges over and over that eventually get them in sync.
Exactly. And if there was no table that was shared, there would be no syncing up. And so similarly in the brain, if there's nothing that can kind of hold the firing apart from the individual firing, then you wouldn't expect there to be anything like that kind of nudging or pushing. And I don't know that there's really been a conversation in neuroscience about that. If we really think that it has this kind of modulatory capacity, do we think that it's like that? Do we think it's like the table? Do we think there's something else in the brain that we've missed? Something that can kind of hold that signal. People say, oh, it's the electric field, but we don't normally think of electric fields. There is some weird stuff in quantum, but we don't normally think of electric fields as like tables like that, like as holding this extra stuff, except for at the quantum level. So at the brain level, is that what we want to say? That there's something special about an electric field? Or are we saying that there's something besides like the neural connect? And of course, there's been some great work on all the things besides neural firing that influence brain activity. So maybe the astrocytes are doing it. Maybe it's the layers. Maybe like one layer is holding the kind of like I don't know, oscillatory activity information, and another layer is, and maybe it's something like that. But that's where I think that if that view is going to get off the ground, there's going to have to be something like that. There's going to have to be a table basically in the brain.
But so, okay, just to lay it out explicitly, the view of what attention is in terms of brain activity is the slow wave oscillations that you put in the frontal cortex. Not that doesn't hinge on that, but that is modulating the more local, faster oscillatory dynamics and neural firing. And it's these slow, long-range oscillations that you put as the seat of an attentional mechanism in the brain.
Yeah.
So so how much of your account depends on that, right? If it turns out that slow wave oscillations don't have the necessary modulatory properties, then do you just go searching for a different mechanism? Or, where is this on your confidence scale, for instance, and how important is it to your account?
I guess I would say I'm not sure about it. So I think it's possible to work out. I think that's like an easy way of seeing causal power is this kind of table to parts, kind of approach. I think a harder way is one in which there's no such thing. At that level, it's descriptive. I think that there would still be room for a causal power account. It's just it's a little bit less interesting. So it's not like it defeats the view. It just it makes it a little harder, I think. Yeah.
Okay. So you talk about the scale-free properties of like oscillations in the brain. One of the things that I just thought of right before we started recording actually was, what about so putting attention at that alpha band or beta band or whatever it is, like slower, longer range oscillations. Why not put it at circadian rhythm, right? Or like, what is special about that band of oscillatory brain activity? There are other oscillations that are even slower, and like circadian rhythm, right, affects our entire bodies. And why not put the seat of attention there? I know that's a ridiculous question, but
no, it's not. I mean, I guess there are different ways of answering that, but one way is just that there's evidence out of Earl Miller's lab actually,
right,
that is a signature of top-down attention in monkeys, but there's no reason to think that doesn't apply to humans. So looking at the relationship between LIP and FEF, for example, in a visual attention paradigm where they contrasted bottom-up and top-down attention, FEF being a frontal area and LIP being a parietal area. So they're kind of standing in for bottom-up and top-down attention, even though they're both relatively high-level areas. That FEF had this signature of a slower wave, and then LIP had the signature of a faster wave. And then I just kind of add that in with all this other evidence on what that means given scale-free dynamics in the brain. Okay, so so part of the reason is just that there's evidence that is a signature of attention. And also that makes sense given that there's a lot of evidence that top-down attention is very highly corresponds with lateral prefrontal, that top-down attention corresponds with that, and that's kind of far along the trajectory, at least for visual, if you think in terms of the visual pathways, that things take a long time to get. That's like about as far as you can get in the brain, lateral prefrontal. And so that would be on a delay. It makes sense that would be on a longer time scale. So it kind of fits with the anatomy as well. But I think that lateral prefrontal, the top-down attention, is that has to be involved for attention to be happening, in my view, for the subject to be involved, in my view. But the subject is not lateral prefrontal cortex. The subject is supposed to be the collection of interests. And so you can understand that more like whole brain activity.
That's so abstract, a collection. It's very abstract. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so I don't know exactly how to think of an interest in neural terms. Yeah. That's another thing that would be helpful, I think. But I just don't know how to translate that. So I'm thinking I'm at a different Mars level right now, Marian level. Yeah. I'm not at the implementation level. But yeah, so you could think of it in terms of like the whole brain activity. So the bottom up signal and the top down signal are both part of that collection. So subject is not just the top down part. The subject would be both. So subject, I sometimes talk about in terms of the pattern. You could think of it as like an interference pattern. So I'm drawing it out like this so you can see that all of the frequencies would matter to the subject if we're talking about their interests. So if their circadian rhythm, if it's like a fluttering eyelash rhythm, I don't know what's like the fastest rhythm, but like there's, lots of different scales that are going to matter to the subject. They all make up the subject. They all make up its set of interests. It's just that power is coming from the slower ones over the faster ones.
So you're starting a neuroscience lab and you want to decouple oscillations from spiking activity because you don't have oscillations, at least the kind that we're interested in, without patterns of spiking activity. And then the oscillations themselves are presumably affecting the spiking activity. And so like these mutual, like the table affects the oscillator, the metronomes actually affect the table as well. How do we pull those apart?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there was a great Luis Pessoa, who's at Maryland, just had a salon. He calls it Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon, where he hosted Earl Miller, Leslie Kay, some other neuroscientists. And this is exactly what they were disputing, whether it was possible to have a neuroscientific experiment that could tease these things apart. So people are working on it. They're thinking about it. It's clearly going to be a really important part of neuroscience going forward. We know that local field potentials are the source of the fMRI signal. They are likely very closely related to EEG. So the ways that we've been measuring the brain seem like they have to do with local field potentials. What are they? So a long time ago, people would just say, oh, they're just a summative, activity near the neuron or whatever. But that doesn't look like that's the whole story. And I think that we want to know what they are because it's important for understanding the mind and the brain. And it would not be surprising if there were these kind of like oscillatory effects given what we know. The haptic, the fact that two neurons that are severed that you can get a signal across that those severed neurons, the haptic coupling, that I think is good evidence for field effects. That's one of the points that I think the people who are interested in oscillations have kind of been pushing. The response that I've seen is, well, it's a small effect. But even a small effect, I mean, we know attention, we don't have a lot of power over our minds. We have a little bit of power over our minds.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. And then we leverage that with lots of other things. But so even a small effect would be, would be a big deal. So I think that we should all be really interested in why that's the case, why there is that haptic coupling. What is the LFP? And hopefully the community, when, as it becomes obsessed with these things, will find an answer as it has to other neuroscientific mysteries in the past.
But if I don't have oscillations, so I was going to say, if I don't have oscillations, that means I don't have a self, but you'll correct me and say that the self is not the oscillations, the self is the collection of interests. But if I don't have oscillations, am I not able to, how does that relate? If my oscillations go away, but my spiking activity is still there, am I missing a self?
That's a good question. So like I said before, my methodology is I take this like experiential information, the neuroscientific information, the behavioral information. And so what we've been talking about is like the neuroscience, the implementation level, which is important.
Which no one cares about these days. So you're in good footing if not, defining things in abstract ways. No one cares about implementing. Yeah.
But I mean, experience also matters. So I've been trying to put forward like what you could take to be a how possible account of the subject. But I do think that evidence of the subject is not limited to evidence from neuroscience. So this is what I take to be the most promising place for the subject in the brain. It's going to be, if there is nothing like that, if it really is just a mere description, oscillations are mere descriptions of
epiphenomena or something.
Yeah, exactly. Then I think it's going to be harder to find something like a subject. I'm not saying that I wouldn't be able to do it, but it would look a little bit more like epicycling. Like I'm just kind of making things up. Whereas what I take myself to have been doing is kind of gathering evidence from different domains and trying to make sense of that different evidence. And I think our experiential evidence points to a subject. I think that when we look at other beings, we see subjects. So we see when someone did something accidentally or intentionally, we can kind of see that in their behavior. We can see it in ourselves experientially. And I think there looks like there's a brain signature as well that might make sense of that. So if I lose one, that doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense anymore, but it doesn't help either. Yeah.
I was also thinking about how far down or back the evolutionary tree to ascribe selves. Do organisms without brains not have selves? Is a brain necessary for self? Easy questions, right?
Yeah. So I've been giving a brain-based account of self. That is certainly where I have been leaning, but I need to work a little bit more on the mechanisms, like what exactly a self is, like a kind of mechanistic account of what the subject is. I've worked on that a little bit, but it's not it still doesn't feel like a complete account, as you've kind of like, what is an interest? How exactly does an interest work?
Yeah. Do plants have a set of interests, for instance? And
right. So I think that if I could get to something like, and I've worked on this a little bit and I haven't found satisfactory tools for what I want to do, but what I would like to see is something like a network science version of the subject. And then it would be testable. Like, can social groups be subjects? Can ant colonies be subjects? Right now, I don't feel confident enough to say that that's not possible. Certainly, you see special kinds of activity in the brain that lend themselves to seeing, okay, there's a possibility here, or the kinds of things I would want the subject to do. But I have to be a lot more specific about what exactly that is in order to say whether or not that same thing is happening in the ant colony or in the social group. And I think that would be really valuable. My suspicion is that there's minimally some kind of like unity in those things. I don't know if it's the same kind of unity, but yeah.
So subjecthood would potentially be multiply realizable.
Possibly. What I think, it's one of the things that I'm also not really sure about is whether So consciousness and the subject are closely related. Consciousness is the way that the subject is related to its world. My suspicion is that even if these other things come along with signatures of a subject in certain respects, that they're not going to have that self-world boundary. So that's another thing where I want to get like down to like a mechanistic picture to see why that wouldn't be the case. And I don't have a full account of that, but I'm really drawn to like Evan Thompson's work on autopoiesis, that there's this that one of the things that is interesting in biology is this self-defining nature of the cell all the way up to the organism. And so I suspect that is playing a key role in what is generating the self-world boundary and generating then that relation with the world. And I suspect that wouldn't be there in the ant colony or in the social group, but I'm not sure. So, yeah.
You have one line in your book that mentions artificial intelligence. And
I don't remember.
Well, I don't have it up, but it was basically you just said that that your account of attention as a collection of interests would be feasible to implement in artificial systems, and therefore the implication would be that artificial systems, we could design them such that they have selves. Have you thought more about this? And I'm just kind of wondering what the wider implication is for artificial intelligence or systems and subjectness, selfhood.
So I think that kind of follows the same trajectory of what I was saying earlier, that if I had this a deeper mechanistic account of a subject, I would be able to say that with more confidence, that it could be done artificially as well. I do think from what I've seen in the AI community so far, I don't think they have anything like what I call attention.
Right. They have the attention mechanisms are very loosely.
Yeah. So they would be more like pre-established filtering or something like that. Maybe like a winner take all mechanism, but nothing like this feedback at the level of the set. I had a conversation about that with two people who, one's the head of AI research at a major company, and the other person is the CEO of his own AI company.
You can't drop names?
No, I don't.
Okay.
That seems disrespectful.
Okay.
Because it was a casual lunch, we were just chatting, but I was talking with them, and I didn't know who they were. And so I was like, I think AI needs attention like this. And they were like, well, we're working on that, actually. So that makes me think that maybe it's possible. At least people are aware that that's going to be an important part of artificial intelligence. That would be my guess, is that would push it forward, is to have a mechanism like that. And some people are trying to introduce a mechanism like that, from my understanding of this casual lunch.
I mean, just to make it, well, I mean, the other question is, do we want to build in something like that into artificial systems?
Yeah.
Or if we don't build it in, would those systems not be intelligent in the way that we think of intelligence? Sorry, I'm getting us down a road that we don't need to go down.
I mean, we're just shooting the shit. We're just saying what we want, right? But what I was saying earlier about if I were to force to kind of go down one path or another, like choose a road, then I would say that the biology is important for consciousness, and that intelligence and consciousness are not the same thing. That I think you can get general intelligence without consciousness. And I think that for that, you're going to need something like attention. That's my kind of guess view, but that consciousness depends on this kind of autopoiesis stuff, this something special about what cells do in organizing themselves, that even if you have attention, don't know that you're going to get consciousness out of it, which is, I mean, for me, that's hopeful, because I don't really want us to be creating a bunch of artificial consciousnesses. But I mean, there are ethical questions and legal questions, all kinds of questions, even about general intelligence. If we're able to create artificial general intelligence, there are risks associated with that, but there are extra risks if they're conscious.
Or if they have selves, which is a separate issue, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But so since something you just said cued me to this, that so in the book and in your works, you claim that attention is not necessary for consciousness and consciousness is not necessary for attention,
Right.
but that attention is necessary for conscious perception, which
Yeah.
can be a little confusing, right?
Yeah.
Can you tease those apart? Because it's the thing that's one of the things that is interesting about how you bring all this together is that you have like these, attention, right, which has different tentacles, and these tentacles touch on different phenomena like consciousness in different ways, right? So it's necessary for one part, but not the other. Can you tease those apart?
Yeah. One of the things that I do in the book is I try to say, look, this is what attention does do for the mind. This is what it doesn't do for the mind. So attention is really important to us, but it's not important for every single thing that we do. I think that's key. You have to have that contrast. If you're not just being like a Freudian, just saying everything, everything is my thing, everything is water, whatever. So in this case, I see consciousness as the relation between the subject and its world. I see perception as a case in which the subject is gathering information from its world. So it's a specific version of that relation. Sensation, I see as the sensory mediated relation with the world. So it's you have this relation with your world through your senses, and you've got then that sensation. That is the kind of psychologist's view of sensation. The philosopher has a completely different definition of sensation. But the psychologist has long seen it as like the raw input, and then perception is kind of the structural version of that raw input. So when you take that raw input and you add structure, you get perception. That's a psychologist's perspective. The philosopher seems to think like sensation is very closely related to consciousness, that it's like the redness of red, like qualia basically and sensation are closely related together. It's a different way of seeing feeling, things.
Right?
Yeah, the feelings. Yeah, exactly. And so then it kind of messes things up, because you're like, okay, well, if it's raw, then is it I mean, I think that it's possible to find common ground between them, but I'm just noting that I'm talking in terms of a psychologist here. I'm talking in terms of this sort of raw input, which I think most of our experiences are a mixture of those things. So most of our experiences, I think, have some of that like unmediated relationship and some structured relationship. But whenever you have an instance of conscious perception, that means that there's structure in that relationship somewhere. That means attention is there somewhere also.
But just to clarify, to you, conscious perception and perception are the same thing? Like perception is necessarily, okay.
And I know that that's like, it's probably a little confusing. Why is she specifying that it's conscious here? And that's just because of the limitations of the evidence that I use, that I rely on phenomenological evidence for that argument. So one of the key pieces of that argument is that if you look at our perceptual experiences, that they always have this foreground background structure, that we know that the thing that's special about perception is that it's structured in some way. And so I kind of go through what are the possible structures that could be the most foundational structures. And I think that foreground background structure is the thing that is never absent, even in balance, even in these really extreme perceptual experiences, you always have that. And so the idea is that that's the thing that's that attention provides, and that's the thing that's at the heart of perception.
So attention,
the question there somewhere. But,
no, that's okay.
Yeah.
But so attention, I mean, so we get to meaning also through this, right? So attention is necessary for our conscious perception, but that is organizing the world into foreground and background, and that is what provides or creates meaning to us. Is that did I say that right? Okay.
That's right. Yeah. So the fact that there's a difference making foreground versus background, any difference making is where you get like Shannon information. So now you've created like a 0 and a 1 or whatever. You need a difference to get Shannon information. But a big idea in information theory within philosophy of information, is that information as we normally mean it is not mere Shannon information. It's Shannon information, difference making plus meaning. And the idea is that what attention's doing is it's making that difference. It's like establishing a difference between foreground and background, but according to the interests of the subject. So the meaning is coming from the fact that the subject has those interests. And so it's differentiating them according to what's valuable to the subject. So you get both. You get the difference and the meaning. And so you get full information from that move, I think.
Yep.
So that's right. So you were asking, like, so why do I say conscious perception? I forgot to bring it back around.
Oh, okay.
It's because my evidence is limited to this evidence from experience. So I don't know, maybe unconscious perception doesn't have foreground background structure. Who knows? I don't know what to say about that. My suspicion is that this holds for perception in general, but I can't really say that because I'm working from conscious experience. It's my evidence base. Yeah.
I don't really know how to phrase this question, but thinking about the account of meaning in that sense. So the interests create the conditions by which we gather meaning from the world. Don't we have to have the meaning already if we're searching for that meaning? Is this a chicken and egg problem?
I don't think so. I think I think what we're doing is we're applying, you're right, we already have the meaning, but we're just applying it to the world. So we're like, okay, what is the meaning of that tree to me? By applying your meaning, your interests to the tree, that's where you're giving it. You're not like giving it meaning, but you're connecting it to your meaning.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So we talked about attention being necessary for conscious perception, but you use the example of what you call conscious entrainment, I think is the phrase.
Yeah.
As evidence that attention is not necessary for consciousness in general.
Right.
So what is conscious entrainment? And I'm wondering if you have continued to think about that or other examples.
So conscious entrainment is probably the easiest way to understand it would be to connect it with Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow experience.
Mm-hmm.
So in flow, as Csikszentmihalyi wrote, for many years about flow is a case where you're an expert in something, you've become very skilled in some kind of activity. For me, this case was drawing. That's the example I think I give in the book, but just think of a skill that you have. And the idea is that when you get to a certain level with that skill, a kind of peak version of a skill, you may have experiences where it comes very easily to you, very naturally to you, and it feels really great. So for Csikszentmihalyi, this was connected to kind of positive psychology, like what kinds of things make your life go well, and being focused on that. For me, I'm obviously just interested in how the mind works. I don't really care. I do care what makes your life
you don't
go
care
well.
How people feel.
But I do, but that's not my focus. One of the things that really distinguishes, the reason I don't use flow psychology language, one of the reasons is for Csikszentmihalyi, he says that flow requires attention.
And effort, right? So it has to be effortful, right?
Yeah, so that's awkward because I'm arguing that these are experiences that are effortless and that don't require attention. And so I think that would throw people off if I started out by describing in flow psychology terms, because I'm not trying to make it about his work. I'm not trying to make it about flow psychology. It just so happens that what I'm describing is very closely related. I think where the discrepancy comes about is that Csikszentmihalyi and many other people, I think, conflate focus with attention. So they think anytime you're focused, that you're necessarily attending. And I think that that's not necessarily the case. I think it's possible to be focused on something as a result of automatic filtering without having to have done any of that prioritization work of attention. So you don't have to apply your interests to the stimuli, I think, to be focused on something. So focus is a kind of like a result. It doesn't tell you the process that led to that result. And I think most of the time, we're focused on things because of our attention process. But in some cases, I think it's possible for us to be focused on things because of automatic processes that don't have anything to do with attention, that are the result of automatic filtering kind of stuff. And that's what I think is going on in these highly skilled cases, is that we have these very, very highly trained automatic processes. And sometimes I think even strategically, we enter into that automatic state on purpose. And we allow ourselves to be engaged with our world in this very fluid way that doesn't require that work of attention, that kind of processing and prioritizing work of attention.
But your phenomenological experience, right? So let's go back to your example. You're drawing, you're not caring about how anyone else feels in the world. And but whether you strategically automated that experience of drawing, and you kind of realize, right, that you've been drawing effortlessly and somewhat automatically, right?
Yeah.
How do you know? And the argument is that attention was not required or being implemented during that.
Yeah.
How do you what if you were just not consciously aware of the effort and attention during that process? How do you know that attention is not working in the background outside of your awareness of it? That's an unfair question, I know.
No, it is a fair question. So this goes back to that methodology that the phenomenology is a key component, but one of the pieces of evidence from behavioral science that I felt is really helpful is the work on choking. So
I'm very familiar with choking, by the way.
Yeah.
I still remember shooting free throws in a basketball game and just the awfulness of it. I missed them both. Yeah. Anyway.
Choking. I have had an experience of choking while giving a talk before where I was mid-sentence and I was like, how does my mouth form words? And I was like, my God, what have I done?
Not good. Not
where you want to be. Yeah. So, I think I recovered, but I think I remember my mouth just was moving and saying nonsense for a couple minutes because I was trying to recover control over that.
Yeah.
But so choking, there are lots of accounts of choking. There's good evidence for all of the different accounts. So it's actually a really tricky case. But at least one of the things that I think that points to is that it's possible for prefrontal cortical activity, for attention to yourself, to disrupt certain kinds of behaviors. And I think that makes a lot of sense of these reports that you hear from highly skilled people that, it's a really common trope in athletic studies of athletes that they shouldn't pay too much attention to what they're doing.
If they're highly skilled.
If they're highly skilled, yes, that's right. So while they're learning, it's a different story. But once they've gotten to a certain level of expertise, they're told, don't think about it, just do it, And I think that it's a fairly common phenomenon. A lot of people have felt this, that you can disrupt what you're doing by paying attention to it. You see that in the behavioral evidence, at least according to one story of choking. And I think if you combine those together, it seems like it's not just that there's automaticity processes and there's attention processes. It seems like there's competition between them. And to me, that makes sense of why people say things like, some musicians say that they play with automaticity. I think what that means to me is that they recognize that they need to use this one type of process some of the time. And so that's what I mean by strategic automaticity. They're going to have these chunks of automaticity that they're going to rely on, but they don't want to be automatic the whole time. They want to insert some kind of creative flourishes or whatever. So they're kind of playing with it. They're incorporating it, but they're using that and they're seeing that as a different mode. So I see that as supportive evidence as well, the behavioral evidence, as well as these kind of phenomenological reports. So it's possible that attention is there, maybe just a little bit of attention, maybe a different form of attention. Some philosophers have said, well, maybe there's automatic attention. Maybe that's the best explanation.
What the hell does that mean? I don't even.
Yeah.
So much of this, just depends on how you define things, of course, which is just a thorny issue. But
that's right. I think it's possible for you to say it's automatic attention. If that's what you're going to do, I think you're going to want to be able to account for what appears to be competition between automatic attention and non-automatic attention. So if you've done that and you're okay, there's these two different kinds of attention, then maybe we are in a similar place. But I find it more helpful to have one thing be attention and one thing be authenticity, as is consistent with like the history of psychology on this topic, just to like buy into that way the words have always been used, and just make sense of these things like the fact that focus can come apart from attention. There's still things you have to explain if you're going to cleave on to that historical distinction between attention and automaticity. But I think it's easier to explain that than it is to say that you have these two forms of attention, one's automatic and one's. Yeah.
I was going to ask you if attention is a switch, this age-old debate in consciousness, right? Is it a switch or a knob, like gradients or on or off? And one could ask the same thing about attention. And I'll just throw in there, regarding what you were just talking about, the difference between quote unquote automated attention and full-blown attention or whatever, that at least in the brain, right, the oscillations are always going.
Yeah.
So they don't just like turn off, but when you're not attending to something, so you still have the oscillations. So anyway, I'll just throw that in there with the question of whether attention is a knob or a switch.
Yeah. So I guess both, unfortunately. So
oh no,
whether or not there is attention is going to be like a switch thing. So like, is it filtering or is there some amount of prefrontal feedback? Then you're going to have that's like a kind difference. So there's just filtering or there's attention, like those are two different things. But then there's going to be degrees of attention within that range, or degrees of, it's not right to call it degrees of attention, but degrees of control or something like that. So there's going to be a wide range of, there's like a sudden onset stimulus, like right now, a basketball like flies at your head or something. Yeah. You don't like have a lot of control over whether you attend basketball. That's a lot of power there. And so you just got like a little, like maybe you like a little bit, we're like, I think I'm just going to direct my attention away from the podcast into the basketball. Maybe there's a little bit of something there. Versus like someone's having a conversation about the Kardashians nearby and you had
to bring up the Kardashians.
You're being focused on the podcast. For some reason, that's my favorite topic. I don't know why.
Okay. All right.
It just shows that I'm old. My pop culture references are old.
Oh, but, maybe that is old. I don't know. Maybe that
it is now. Yeah.
Was my age. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. So you're effortfully blocking that out, whether you care about them or not. It's something that matters to you, but it's not like the basketball flying at your head. You can use effort to overcome it and like stay with the podcast or stay with the conversation in the cafe or whatever. You don't have to listen to the conversation about the Kardashians.
Why would you ever block out the Kardashians? Shouldn't we be? I don't understand. Yeah.
But yeah, but if you do, then you've asserted a little more control than over the basketball. So yeah, I think it comes in degrees once you're in attention land, but but whether or not it's attention, I think you can see that as a switch.
All right. Well, Carolyn, I know that you need to get to work soon and I've kept you long enough. Sorry that I was all over the place. This happens all the time, but I really appreciate. Oh, great. Yeah. Thanks for coming on and spending your time with me. So no new book coming out. I thought you were working on like mental control book or something.
I did just publish a book called Attention and Mental Control. It's a shorter book. So it's a different kind of book. It's not me getting really, really deep with a new topic. Many of the themes are the same. I'm basically explaining what mental control is. I'm offering an account of mental control, which would be familiar with readers of this book.
Did you write it in a state of conscious entrainment? If everything was old hat to you?
I don't remember anything. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I did not write it in a state of I wrote it like a regular person, but it didn't take quite as long. It didn't take quite as much. It was definitely using some of the resources I'd already gained from my previous study.
But by the way, I suggest I'll link to this also in the show notes that you recently published or edited with a co-editor a book on all the topics of lots of different philosophical topics. And I've started reading it and I'm really enjoying that as well. So
cool. I'm so glad you like it. Yeah, it was a collaboration really of all those 30, more than 30 philosophers and neuroscientists. So yeah, cool. I'm glad you like that.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, and keep up the good work. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on. It's great talking to you.
I alone produce Brain Inspired. If you value this podcast, consider supporting it through Patreon to access full versions of all the episodes and to join our Discord community. Or if you want to learn more about the intersection of neuroscience and AI, consider signing up for my online course, Neuro AI, The Quest to Explain Intelligence. Go to braininspired.co to learn more. To get in touch with me, email paul@braininspired.co. You're hearing music by The New Year. Find them at thenewyear.net. Thank you for your support. See you next time.